The acidic smell of burnt coffee and day-old grease clung to the air in the North Star Diner, a smell Alara Vance had long ago learned to ignore. It was part of the uniform, as much as the faded blue apron and the sensible, soul-crushing shoes. She moved between the cracked vinyl booths and chipped formica tables with an economy of motion that was less about grace and more about survival. Each shift was a tightrope walk over a chasm of exhaustion. In booth number 7, a man sat alone, an island of stillness in the diner's chaotic sea. He looked to be in his late 60s, dressed in clothes that were clean but unremarkable. A worn tweed jacket, gray trousers, and scuffed leather shoes. He hadn't looked at his phone once. Instead, he nursed a single cup of black coffee and read a thick, leather-bound book, his brow furrowed in concentration. Alara had served him 3 times in the past week. He was quiet, polite, and always left a precise 20% tip in cash. He was, in short, the perfect customer, a ghost who paid his bill. She had no idea he was Julian Croft, a man whose net worth was larger than the GDP of several small countries, and who owned the very building the diner was in, along with the 50-story skyscraper it was attached to. Tonight, however, the relative peace of the Tuesday evening lull was being methodically dismantled by one person, Trent Donovan. Trent was the night manager's son, a 25-year-old with a cruel smirk and the unearned confidence of a man who had never faced a single consequence. His mother, Mrs. Donovan, a woman worn down to a nub by life and her loathsome offspring, allowed him to treat the diner as his personal fiefdom. "Vance, table 4 needs a wipe down. Did your hands forget how to hold a rag?" Trent's voice cut through the low hum of conversation. Alara, who had just finished taking an order from a family of tourists, didn't flinch. She gave the family a small, reassuring nod and turned. "On it, Trent." She grabbed a damp cloth from the service station. As she approached table 4, Trent deliberately stuck out his foot. It was a petty, childish move, but Alara was tired, her reflexes dulled by a 10-hour shift. Her shoe caught his ankle, and she stumbled forward, the heavy-duty ceramic coffee pot she was carrying in her other hand, lurching from her grasp. She tried to save it, a desperate, instinctive twist of her body, but it was useless. It crashed to the linoleum floor, shattering into a dozen large pieces and sending a spray of scalding brown liquid across the checkered tiles. A collective gasp went through the diner. The man in booth 7 looked up from his book, his placid expression hardening into one of sharp, sudden focus. Trent let out a theatrical sigh. "Clumsy, Vance. Really, really clumsy. That's coming out of your pay." "It was an accident," Alara said, her voice low as she knelt to pick up the larger shards of ceramic, her fingers automatically avoiding the sharp edges. "An accident you caused," he sneered, enjoying the audience. He sauntered over, looming above her. "You know, my dad is thinking of selling this place to some big corporate chain. They have standards, efficiency, people who don't break things. You wouldn't last a day." Alara ignored him, focusing on the task. She could feel the heat radiating from the spilled coffee through the thin fabric of her trousers. The sting was nothing compared to the slow burn of humiliation. Her right hand, her dominant hand, reached for a particularly large curved piece of the pot handle. As her fingers closed around it, Trent's expensive loafer came down hard, not on the ceramic but directly on the back of her hand, pinning it to the floor. A sound, a wet, sickening crack, echoed in the sudden, dead silence of the diner. An explosion of white-hot agony shot up Ilara's arm. A scream tore from her throat, raw and involuntary. She recoiled, cradling her hand to her chest as tears flooded her eyes, blurring the harsh, fluorescent lights into a smear of pain. "Oh, boo-hoo!" Trent scoffed, though even he looked momentarily surprised by the sound. "Stop being so dramatic. It's just a little tap." But the man in booth 7 had seen it all. He had seen the deliberate placement of the foot. He had seen the malicious press of weight. He had heard the unmistakable sound of a bone snapping. Julian Croft slowly and deliberately closed his book, the soft thud of leather on formica as loud as a gunshot in the stunned room. He placed a $10 bill on the table, slid out of the booth, and began to walk toward the unfolding horror. He was no longer a quiet, anonymous customer. Every step he took was measured, deliberate, and radiated an authority that the diner had never felt before. Mrs. Donovan finally scurried out from the kitchen, her face a mask of panic denial. Trent, what is going on out here? Nothing, Ma. Vance is just clumsy. Threw a fit and broke a coffee pot, and now she's faking an injury to get attention. Alara was on her feet now, hunched over, biting her lips so hard she tasted blood. The pain was a physical presence, a roaring monster in her arm. Her right hand was already beginning to swell, a grotesque, puffy caricature of itself. I'm not faking, she whispered, her voice shaking with a mixture of agony and rage. You stepped on my hand. You broke it. Prove it, Trent challenged, his smirk returning. He was invincible here. He always was. That won't be necessary. The voice was calm, deep, and carried an unnerving weight of command. Trent and his mother turned. Julian Croft stood there, his expression unreadable, his eyes the color of cold steel. And who are you? Trent asked, puffing out his chest. Some old guy looking for a free meal? Get back to your table. Julian ignored him completely, his gaze fixed on Alara. He looked at her injured hand, then at her face, which was pale and streaked with tears. Yet her jaw was set with a defiant strength that seemed utterly out of place amidst her pain. Are you able to call for help? He asked her directly, his voice softening with a trace of concern. Before she could answer, Mrs. Donovan intervened, wringing her hands. Sir, I'm so sorry for this disturbance. It's just a staff issue. We'll handle it. She shot Alara a venomous look. She's fired, of course, for causing this scene and breaking company property. She's fired? Julian repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. He turned his full attention to Mrs. Donovan, and for the first time, she felt a genuine prickle of fear. There was something about this man, a power that coiled beneath his simple clothes. You're firing an employee your son just assaulted, an employee who is now seriously injured and in need of immediate medical attention? He didn't. It was an accident, she stammered. I watched him deliberately place his foot on her hand and apply pressure. I heard the bone break, Julian stated, each word a block of ice. As did everyone else in this diner. He let his gaze sweep across the other patrons, who quickly looked down at their plates, suddenly terrified to be witnesses. Trent, emboldened by a lifetime of impunity, stepped forward. Listen, old man, you don't know what you're talking about. This is my mother's diner, and we can fire whoever we want. Now get out before I call the cops and have you arrested for trespassing. Julian Croft allowed a small, cold smile to touch his lips. It was a terrifying sight. Please do. Call the police. I insist. While you're at it, you should probably also call an ambulance for Ms. Vance, and a lawyer for yourself. You're going to need a very good one. He reached into his jacket pocket, but instead of a wallet, he pulled out a slim, elegant phone. He tapped the screen once, then held it to his ear. Genevieve, he said, his voice now crisp and corporate, I need you to do 3 things. First, alert the legal team. We have an assault and a wrongful termination at the North Star Diner on 57th. Second, have Dr. Morrison meet me at the emergency room at Lenox Hill in 30 minutes. Tell him it's a potential crush injury to the right hand, multiple fractures likely. Third, one, initiate the Donovan portfolio review. Full asset seizure clause, effective immediately. He hung up. The color drained from Trent's face. He didn't understand all the words, but legal team and asset seizure were clear enough. What did you just do? Julian finally looked at him, and the full, formidable weight of his identity seemed to settle into the room. Your mother doesn't own this diner, young man. She manages it on a lease-to-own contract, a contract held by a parent company. That company is Croft Enterprises, my company. And you, Mr. Donovan, have just violated a dozen clauses in that contract, not to mention state and federal law. He turned to the trembling Mrs. Donovan. As of this moment, your management contract is terminated. You have 1 hour to collect your personal belongings and vacate the premises. Security will be here in 5 minutes to escort you out. He then turned back to Alara, who was staring at him, her pain momentarily forgotten, her mind reeling in disbelief. His entire demeanor had changed. The hard shell of command dissolved, replaced by a quiet, focused concern. Ms. Vance, he said gently, my name is Julian Croft. I am going to take you to the hospital myself. Everything will be taken care of. Do you understand? Alara could only nod, a wave of dizziness washing over her as the adrenaline faded and the full throbbing reality of her injury crashed back in. She looked from the powerful, mysterious man before her to the stunned, pathetic figures of Trent and his mother. Her world, which had been a predictable cycle of grueling work and quiet desperation, had just shattered, much like the coffee pot on the floor. But as Julian Croft gently guided her toward the door, away from the wreckage of her job, she couldn't tell if she was being rescued or simply swept up into a different, more powerful storm. The emergency room at Lenox Hill was a world away from the North Star Diner. The scent of antiseptic replaced the smell of grease, and the low hum of medical equipment stood in for the clatter of plates. Elara felt untethered, a ghost in a blue apron adrift in a sea of sterile white. The pain in her hand was a constant, searing throb, a brutal metronome counting out the seconds of this surreal nightmare. Julian Croft moved through the chaos with an unnerving calm. A word to the triage nurse, a brief flash of a black card she couldn't quite see, and suddenly they were being led not to the crowded waiting area, but to a private examination room. A man in expensive-looking scrubs with silver-streaked hair and a kind face was waiting for them. He introduced himself as Dr. Morrison, a top orthopedic hand surgeon. He spoke to Julian with a familiar deference that baffled Elara. "Julian, what have we got here?" the doctor asked, his eyes immediately assessing Elara's swollen, discolored hand. "This is Elara Vance. There was an incident at one of my properties," Julian explained, the words clipped and precise. "Blunt force trauma to the dorsal side of the right hand." Dr. Morrison gently took her wrist, his touch surprisingly delicate. Elara flinched, biting back a whimper. "Okay, Elara, let's take a look. This is going to be unpleasant, but I need to see the extent of the damage before we get you to imaging." As the doctor worked, Julian stood near the door, his arms crossed, a silent, imposing guardian. He had shed the tweed jacket, and in a simple dark merino wool sweater, he looked less like a harmless pensioner and more like what he was, a man accustomed to power. Elara kept glancing at him, trying to reconcile the quiet man from the diner with this commanding figure who summoned top surgeons with a single phone call. Why was he doing this? Pity? A guilty conscience for being a bystander until the very end? It felt like more than that. There was an intensity in his gaze when he looked at her, an analytical curiosity that made her feel like a puzzle he was determined to solve. The X-rays confirmed their fears. 2 of her metacarpal bones were fractured, a clean break on one, a more complex fracture on the other. "The boxer's fracture is what we sometimes call this one," Dr. Morrison explained, pointing to the screen. "But this second one, it's a nasty break, right near the joint. It will require surgery to set it properly with pins. We need to do it to ensure you regain full mobility." Surgery, pins. The words echoed in Elara's mind, each one a nail in the coffin of her immediate future. Full mobility. A chill snaked down her spine that had nothing to do with the pain. I don't have insurance," she whispered, the confession tasting like ash in her mouth. It was the secret shame she lived with every day, the terrifying reality that one accident, one illness, could ruin everything. Dr. Morrison looked to Julian, who answered before the doctor could. "That is not a concern. You will receive the best possible care, Ms. Vance. The only thing you need to focus on is your recovery. Dr. Morrison will perform the surgery himself tonight." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a statement of fact. Events were moving around her, propelled by this man's wealth and will, and she was too exhausted and in too much pain to resist. Hours later, she awoke in a private hospital room, the kind she had only ever seen on television. The city lights glittered through a large picture window. Her right arm was encased in a heavy cast from her knuckles to her elbow, a dead weight throbbing with a dull, persistent ache. Julian Croft was sitting in a chair by the window, not reading, but simply watching the city. He turned as she stirred. "How do you feel?" he asked, his voice low. "Like I've been run over by a truck," she said hoarsely, her eyes filled with tears of frustration. "Thank you, Mr. Croft, for all of this. But I don't understand why. You could have just given me some money, called an ambulance. You didn't have to." She gestured vaguely with her good hand at the luxurious room. He stood and walked to her bedside. Let's be clear, Ms. Vance. What happened tonight was my responsibility. It occurred on my property, perpetrated by an employee of a company I ultimately control. My failure was not in my response, but in my allowing a culture where a person like Trent Donovan could feel empowered to act as he did. This, he said, his eyes meeting hers, is not charity. This is me, correcting a catastrophic failure of my own system. His explanation was logical, corporate, yet it felt incomplete. There was still that look in his eye, that simmering curiosity. I've had my assistant Genevieve make some arrangements, he continued, shifting to a more practical tone. Your rent is paid for the next 3 months. A daily meal service will be arranged. You are not to worry about finances. Your only job is to heal. My grandfather, Ilara said suddenly, panic flaring in her chest. I have to take care of my grandfather. He's waiting for me. Arthur Vance, 78, former head archivist at Columbia University's Rare Book and Manuscript Library, retired 10 years ago. Lives with you in your apartment in Washington Heights, Julian recited calmly. Don't worry, Genevieve has already arranged for a full-time home health aide to assist him, starting tomorrow morning. He's been informed that you had a minor accident at work and will be staying in the hospital for a day or two for observation. Ilara stared at him, stunned into silence. He knew about Arthur. He knew where he worked. In the space of a few hours, this man had not only taken over her medical care, but he had also peeled back the layers of her life and inserted himself into them with terrifying efficiency. You investigated me, she said, the realization dawning. It wasn't a question. I needed to understand the situation fully to provide the correct support, he said without a trace of apology. In doing so, my team found your academic records. You were 2 years into a master's program in library science with a specialization in conservation and preservation at Pratt. You dropped out 3 years ago, on the same time your grandfather's medical costs began to escalate due to his Parkinson's. He knew everything. The weight of her sacrifices, the quiet death of her dreams, all laid bare in a sterile report on a billionaire's desk. The humiliation from the diner returned. But this was a different, more invasive kind. He had seen her at her weakest, and now he had dissected her entire life. Why are you doing this, Mr. Croft? She asked again, her voice trembling. What do you want from me? Julian Croft pulled the chair closer to her bed and sat down. The analytical sharpness in his eyes softened, replaced by something else, something she couldn't quite name. It looked almost like recognition. When you were on the floor, he began slowly, in pain after that, Animal had just assaulted you. You were picking up the broken pieces of the coffee pot, but you weren't just grabbing them. Your fingers, even then, were automatically avoiding the sharpest edges. You were assessing the fractures in the ceramic, sorting the pieces by size. It was methodical, instinctive. He leaned forward slightly. It was the action of someone who is professionally trained to see how broken things can be put back together. Someone who understands the nature of fragmentation and the delicacy of repair. He let that sink in. She stared at her cast, at the useless, broken hand hidden inside it. The one tool she had to practice her art, to pursue her passion, was shattered. The irony was so cruel it was almost comical. My grandfather is a collector, Julian continued, his voice drawing her back. Not of companies or real estate. He collected stories, histories. He believed the most valuable things in the world were the artifacts that told those stories. Books, letters, manuscripts. He spent his life preserving them. He passed that passion on to me. He paused, his gaze distant for a moment. I own one of the largest private collections of historical documents in the world, Ms. Vance, and much of it is in a state of decay. I have spent years searching for a chief conservator, someone with the right touch, the right eye, the right soul for the work. Someone who doesn't just see an old piece of paper, but sees the life it represents. He looked directly at her now, his eyes boring into hers. I believe I may have found that person tonight, kneeling on the dirty floor of a failing diner. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't about pity. It wasn't about corporate liability. It was a job interview. The most bizarre, terrifying, and consequential job interview of her life. He hadn't just seen a waitress being abused. He had seen a conservator in the wild, her instincts laid bare by trauma. The discovery that had left him stunned wasn't her poverty or her sad backstory. It was the discovery of a rare talent, hidden in the last place on earth he ever expected to find it. The next 6 weeks were a blur of prescribed stillness. Ilara's life was now governed by physical therapy appointments and the slow, agonizing process of healing. The cast came off, revealing a pale, atrophied arm and a hand held together by a network of angry red scars and the promise of metal pins beneath the skin. The pain was no longer sharp, but a dull, constant ache, a reminder of her fragility. Julian Croft's mysterious organization, Genevieve, was a ghost in the machine of her life. A car would appear to take her to therapy. Groceries would be delivered. A pleasant, capable woman named Clara cared for her grandfather, Arthur, with a tenderness that eased Ilara's deepest anxieties. Arthur, for his part, was thriving. He adored Clara and was fascinated by the story of Ilara's anonymous benefactor. "Sounds like something out of Dickens, my dear," he'd say, his eyes twinkling as Ilara helped him with his own shaky hands. A modern-day magwitch appearing from the ether to right a terrible wrong. Ilara said nothing of Julian's true identity or his strange, implicit offer. It felt too fragile to put into words, a dream that might evaporate if exposed to the light. What if her hand never fully healed? What if she couldn't regain the fine motor control, the surgeon-like steadiness her work required? The fear was a constant companion, a cold knot in her stomach. She spent her days exercising her hand with therapeutic putty and specialized tools, each tiny movement a monumental effort. She would try to hold a pencil, her fingers trembling, the lines she drew jagged and uncertain. Frustration would well up, hot and bitter, and she would have to stop, breathing through the tears, before she could begin again. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, Genevieve called. Her voice was, as always, crisp and devoid of emotion. "Mr. Croft would like to see you tomorrow at 10 a.m. A car will be waiting." It wasn't a request. The car, a discreet black sedan, took her not to a gleaming skyscraper, but to a nondescript brownstone on the Upper East Side. The door was opened by Genevieve herself, a woman in her 40s with an air of severe competence. She led Ilara through a quiet, climate-controlled hallway into a room that made Ilara's breath catch in her chest. It was a library, but to call it that felt like an understatement. It was a cathedral of knowledge. 2 stories of floor-to-ceiling shelves crafted from dark mahogany, filled with thousands of leather-bound volumes. A rolling ladder stood against one wall, and in the center of the room, on a large oak table, lay a single, open document under a carefully calibrated light. Julian Croft stood by the table, dressed not in a suit, but in a comfortable gray cardigan. He looked more like a scholar than a billionaire. "Ms. Vance, Ilara, thank you for coming," he said, his voice softer here, in his sanctuary. "How is your hand?" "Getting stronger," she said, instinctively flexing her fingers. The movement was still stiff. "Good." He gestured to the document on the table. "I wanted to show you something." She approached cautiously. It was a letter, written on old yellowed rag paper. The ink was faded, the script elegant but difficult to decipher. The edges were crumbling, and a large dark water stain marred the upper right corner. "It's a letter from Abigail Adams to her son, John Quincy Adams, while he was traveling in Europe," Julian explained. "Written in 1780, it's never been published. I acquired it at auction last year. As you can see, it's in a deplorable state. My current archival team says the water damage is too severe. They're afraid any attempt to treat the paper will cause the ink to bleed, rendering it illegible forever. They've recommended it be sealed in an inert gas container, to be preserved but never read again." Ilara leaned closer, her professional instincts overriding her nervousness. Her eyes scanned the document, not just reading the words, but reading the object itself. She saw the delicate fibers of the paper, the chemical composition of the iron gall ink, the way the mold had blossomed and died along the watermark. "They're wrong," she said, the words coming out before she could stop them. Julian raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" They're afraid of the ink because they're thinking of using a traditional aqueous treatment. That would be a disaster, she explained, her voice gaining confidence. She pointed with her good hand, her injured one resting protectively on the table's edge. But look at the composition of the stain. It's not just water. There's a high concentration of iron, probably from a leaky roof or pipe. The discoloration is mostly oxidation. You could treat it locally with a chelating agent like Eddie applied in a gel solution. It would lift the iron stains without dissolving the ink's binder. You'd have to be incredibly careful, work under a microscope, but it's salvageable. It's more than salvageable. It can be read. She stopped, suddenly aware that she had been lecturing a man worth billions of dollars. A hot flush crept up her neck. I'm sorry, I overstepped. Julian Croft was silent for a long moment. He wasn't looking at the letter anymore. He was looking at her, and the expression on his face was one of profound satisfaction, like a grandmaster watching his opponent walk into a perfectly laid trap. You haven't overstepped, Alara, he said, his voice filled with a quiet intensity. You have just passed the test. He then gestured to the rest of the library. This is only a fraction of the collection. There are letters from Lincoln, first drafts from Hemingway, scientific notes from Marie Curie, thousands of pieces of history slowly turning to dust. I've spent a fortune acquiring them, but I've come to realize that owning them is meaningless if their stories are lost. He walked over to a large architectural model that was covered by a silk cloth. With a fluid motion, he pulled the cloth away. It was a stunningly detailed model of a modern, four-story building made of glass and stone. This is the Croft Center for Preservation and Study. We break ground in 3 months. It will be the most advanced conservation facility in the world, equipped with technology that doesn't even exist in most university labs. It will also have a fellowship program to train the next generation of conservators so that this knowledge is never lost. He turned back to her, his eyes serious. A center like this needs a leader, not a manager or a bureaucrat, but an artist, a visionary, someone with your hands, your eyes, and your heart. He paused. The position of chief conservator and director of the center is yours if you want it. You would have a team, a budget that is essentially unlimited, and the freedom to build this institution from the ground up, according to your vision. Alara felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. The scale of what he was offering was incomprehensible. It wasn't just a job. It was a life's work, a legacy. It was the dream she had been forced to bury, resurrected, and handed to her, more magnificent than she had ever imagined. But a shadow of doubt lingered. Mr. Croft, my hand. I don't know if I'll ever be able to do the delicate work myself again. What good is a director who can't lead by example? Your most valuable tool was never your hand, Alara. It's your mind, he said firmly. You will teach, you will guide, you will inspire, and your hand will heal. I have faith in that. The question is, do you? Tears welled in her eyes, but for the first time in a very long time, they were not tears of pain or frustration. They were tears of overwhelming, terrifying hope. She looked at her scarred hand, then at the letter from a mother to her son, a fragile piece of a life that had survived for over 2 centuries, waiting for someone to save it. She took a deep breath, the air thick with the scent of old paper and new beginnings. Yes, she whispered, the word feeling impossibly large in the quiet room. The word yes was a fragile bridge, thrown across a chasm of disbelief. In the silent, mahogany-scented cathedral of Julian's library, Alara Vance felt it tremble beneath the weight of her own past. The scent of burnt coffee and old grease, a ghost scent she thought she'd left behind, seemed to cling to her still, a reminder of the linoleum floor and the sickening crack of her own bones. Now she was being offered a kingdom of broken things waiting to be made whole. It was the only kind of kingdom she had ever wanted. In the months that followed, that single word became an engine. The Croft Center for Preservation and Study rose from a plot of earth on the city's Museum Mile, a structure of glass and Indiana limestone that seemed to inhale light. Alara lived inside the whirlwind of its creation. Her days were a blur of architectural drafts, HVAC specifications for archival vaults, and interviews with chemists and art historians who possessed doctorates from universities older than the United States. She moved through this world with a quiet, ferocious competence, her knowledge honed in the solitary late nights of her abandoned master's program, proving to be preternaturally sharp. Yet imposter syndrome was a constant, low-grade fever. She would sit in meetings with world-renowned engineers, discussing the merits of anoxic pest eradication systems, and a voice in her head would whisper, "You were cleaning grease traps 6 months ago. You have no right to be here." She felt like a carefully constructed forgery, terrified that the slightest scrutiny would reveal the cheap paper beneath the ink. Her shield was Julian Croft's absolute unwavering faith, a force so potent it often felt like an external power source keeping her upright. Her hand was a parallel journey, a landscape of healing she navigated with the same meticulous, frustrating patience. The physical therapist, a no-nonsense woman named Maria, pushed her relentlessly. The exercises were agonizingly small, picking up a single grain of rice with a pair of tweezers, tracing a perfect circle, holding a scalpel steady for 60 seconds. Each session left her hand trembling with exhaustion, a dull fire radiating from the network of scars on its dorsal side. The scars were a pale, silvery map of her trauma, a permanent reminder of Trent Donovan's loafer and the life she had escaped. Some nights she would wake up from dreams of falling, the phantom sensation of the impact jolting her from sleep, her heart hammering against her ribs. The whispers began subtly. In the rarefied air of the art and academic worlds, where reputation is currency, the appointment of an unknown to such a prestigious post was not just an anomaly, it was an affront. The chief antagonist was a man she had never met, Dr. Alistair Finch, the celebrated head of conservation at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Finch was a creature of the establishment, a man whose articles were published in every important journal and whose name was synonymous with orthodox, pedigreed conservation. He had been publicly courting Croft for this very project for years, and Ilara's appointment was a humiliation he could not abide. He never attacked her directly. His methods were far more insidious. An interview in an obscure academic quarterly would appear, where Finch would lament the new trend of philanthropic sentimentalism, warning that untrained hands, however well-intentioned, pose a grave threat to our shared cultural heritage. A blog post from a respected European conservator would question the unusual hiring practices at the New Croft Center, citing unnamed sources who worried about a lack of peer-reviewed credentials at the highest level. It was a campaign of 1,000 cuts, designed to bleed her credibility dry before she ever began. Ilara felt each one like a needle prick, injecting poison into her deepest insecurities. The true crisis arrived with the Florentine folios. The discovery of a lost portfolio of Leonardo da Vinci's anatomical sketches was an event of seismic significance. Julian, in a move of breathtaking audacity, acquired the entire collection at a private sale, announcing that their analysis and first-ever public exhibition would be the inaugural event of the Croft Center. The world's attention, which had been a low hum of professional curiosity, became a blinding, focused spotlight. The pressure on Ilara was no longer abstract, it was crushing. Finch saw his moment. He convened a press conference at the Met, ostensibly to discuss a new acquisition of his own. But the questions inevitably turned to the folios. His response was a masterpiece of professional concern trolling. "It is, of course, a triumph for the city," he began, his face a mask of scholarly gravity. "But my colleagues and I have seen the preliminary spectrographic analyses. There is an issue with folio 17, the study of the brachial plexus. Leonardo appears to have used an experimental binder in his charcoal fixative. It seems to be a casein-based compound mixed with wine tannins. It is highly unstable. Any attempt at traditional deacidification or even simple humidity control could cause catastrophic blooming and flaking. The ink would literally lift off the page." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Frankly, the technology to safely stabilize that page does not yet exist. The responsible course of action, the only course of action, would be to permanently seal the folio in an argon gas enclosure, to preserve it by entombing it. It is a tragedy that it may never be properly studied, But our first duty is to prevent its utter destruction at the hands of overeager ambition. The message was clear, and it reverberated through the global media. Ilara Vance is not equipped to handle this. She will destroy a Leonardo. That evening, Julian found Ilara in the main conservation lab of the nearly completed center. The room, vast and silent, smelled of filtered air and fresh paint. On a central workstation, under the glare of a single diagnostic lamp, lay a high-resolution facsimile of Folio 17V. The intricate network of nerves and muscles, rendered with divine genius, was clouded by the faint, ghostly haze of the unstable fixative. It looked like a masterpiece holding its breath, a breath it might never release. "My legal team is preparing a defamation suit," Julian said, his voice a low growl. He stood by the door, his fury a palpable force in the sterile room. "My PR division can release our own findings, discredit his analysis. We can fight him in the press." Ilara didn't look up from the facsimile. She saw Finch's strategy for what it was. A perfect trap. If she did nothing, he was proven right. If she tried and failed, she would be ruined. A pariah who had destroyed a priceless piece of world history. Finch didn't need to win. He just needed her to lose. "No," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He's right. About the risk. A standard aqueous treatment would be a disaster. Pouring it into an argon case, it's a failure of imagination, but it isn't wrong. It's just a surrender." She finally turned to look at Julian, and he saw the exhaustion in her eyes, but beneath it, a tiny, defiant ember. "Fighting him with lawyers and press releases won't work. This isn't a battle of opinions. It's a battle of chemistry, and it has to be won here, in this room." For the first time since she'd met him, Ilara saw a flicker of uncertainty in Julian Croft's eyes. He had bet his reputation on her, and now at the final hurdle, the odds seemed insurmountable. "What are you proposing?" he asked. "I need time," she said, "and I need you to keep everyone away. Finch, the press, the board, everyone. I need to be alone with it." The days that followed were a descent into solitude. Ilara moved into a small guest suite at the center, effectively living in the lab. The world outside ceased to exist. Her life contracted to the four walls of the lab and the single impossible problem on the table. She worked with a feverish intensity, sleeping in 4-hour bursts, eating meals she didn't taste. She filled whiteboards with chemical equations, ran simulations on the center's powerful computers, and cross-referenced centuries of archival records on Renaissance-era binders and pigments. Her injured hand ached constantly, a dull throb that was both a torment and a motivator. It reminded her of what she had lost and what she was fighting for. She spent an hour each day on her physical therapy, her movements now precise, automatic. She was pushing past healing and into the realm of reforging, willing the damaged nerves and tissues to become stronger than they had been before. One evening, lost in a dead end of research, she called her grandfather. Arthur's voice, frail but warm, was an anchor in her storm-tossed mind. She didn't tell him the specifics of the pressure she was under, only the technical nature of the problem. A fragile drawing, a fugitive binder, an impossible task. "Ah, the arrogance of the modern," Arthur chuckled softly. "We think every problem is new. Leonardo was not just an artist, my dear. He was an alchemist. He saw the world as a series of interconnected systems. He wouldn't have chosen his materials at random. The tannin in the wine, the casein from the milk. What do they have in common? They are organic. They are proteins. You're not trying to fix a chemical stain, Ilara. You are trying to heal a biological system." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. Heal a biological system. She had been thinking like Finch, like a modern chemist trying to impose a solution. She needed to think like a conservator. She needed to think like Leonardo. The breakthrough came at 3 in the morning, fueled by coffee and her grandfather's insight. She wasn't dealing with a simple chemical compound, but a complex protein chain. A traditional solvent would dissolve it, but what if she could introduce something that would gently cross-link it, reinforcing it at a molecular level without altering its composition? She found her answer in an obscure paper on the preservation of ancient protein-based adhesives involving a modified enzymatic treatment delivered in an aerosolized vapor within a precisely controlled microclimate. It was a technique that existed only in theory. It had never been attempted. It would require a level of control, a steadiness of hand that she wasn't sure she possessed. The night she decided to make the attempt, a profound calm settled over her. The center was silent, the city a glittering tapestry beyond the vast glass windows. This was not for Julian, or the press, or to defeat Alistair Finch. This was for the drawing itself, for the ghost of the man who had made it 500 years before. And it was for her. She placed the real folio seminimus inside the custom-built environmental chamber. For hours she worked through the chamber's sealed gloves, her movements slow and deliberate. She calibrated the humidity, introduced the enzymatic vapor molecule by molecule, her eyes fixed to a digital microscope that magnified the paper fibers into a landscape of rolling hills. She watched as the vapor settled onto the charcoal particles, and under the microscope's eye, she saw the miracle. The cassin binder, once brittle and flaky, was stabilizing, its protein chains gently reknitting themselves. The fugitive dust was becoming one with the paper again, not through force but through a scientifically guided act of healing. Her right hand, the one Trent Donovan had tried to destroy, moved with an artist's grace. It held the microscopic tools, making infinitesimal adjustments, its movements as steady and certain as the North Star. The scars gleamed faintly under the lab lights, no longer a mark of weakness, but a testament to the fact that what is broken can, with patience and will, be made stronger in the mending. When the sun rose, it was done. The page was stable. The drawing was saved. It was more vibrant, more alive than it had been a moment before. Ilara leaned her forehead against the cool glass of the chamber, tears tracing paths down her exhausted face. It was a victory won in total silence, witnessed by no one. It was the most profound victory of her life. 2 weeks later, the Croft Center for Preservation and Study held its official opening. The event was not the bombastic gala the media had anticipated. Instead, Julian had invited a small select group, the directors of the Uffizi, the Louvre, and the Getty, along with a handful of the world's most revered conservators and art historians. Alistair Finch was among them, his expression a tight mask of condescending curiosity. He had come to witness a surrender. They gathered in the main conservation lab. Ilara, dressed in a simple dark dress, stood beside Folio 17, which was displayed not in an argon case but under a simple museum-quality vitrine. She spoke for 20 minutes, her voice clear and steady. She did not mention Finch or his criticisms. She simply detailed her process, her research, and her findings. She showed them the microscopic imagery, the spectrographic data, the evidence of a thing not just saved, but reborn. A silence fell over the room as she finished. It was a silence filled with awe. The director of the Uffizi, an elderly Italian woman with eyes that had seen everything, walked to the vitrine, peered at the folio for a long time, and then turned to Ilara. She said nothing. She simply inclined her head in a gesture of profound, absolute respect. In that moment, Alistair Finch became irrelevant. He hadn't been defeated in a public duel. He had been rendered obsolete by a superior intellect and a more profound philosophy. He faded into the background, a relic of an old way of thinking, his reputation not destroyed in a blaze, but quietly extinguished by the bright, clear light of Ilara's achievement. Later that evening, after the guests had departed, Ilara stood with Julian in the main gallery. The Florentine folios were arranged in a quiet, stunning procession, their genius shining out into the climate-controlled air. "I saw the security logs," Julian said, his voice soft. "You were in that lab for 72 straight hours. I nearly came down here a dozen times." "Why didn't you?" she asked, turning to face him. "Because this was never about my faith in you, Ilara," he said, his gaze direct and honest. "It was about you finding faith in yourself. I could give you the building, the tools, the money, but the victory, that had to be yours alone." He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw him not as a billionaire benefactor or that a corporate titan, but as a man who understood the true nature of value. He had collected all these priceless things, but he knew they were meaningless without the human spirit to understand and preserve them. The North Star Diner is being demolished next week, he said, an almost random thought, to make way for a park. Ilara thought of the cracked vinyl, the smell of grease, the slow-burning humiliation. It felt like a story from someone else's life, a distant prologue. She looked down at her right hand, flexing her fingers. The ache was a faint, familiar echo. The scars were a part of her now, woven into the grain of her skin. They were not something to be hidden. They were proof of the pressure she had withstood. She reached out and laid her hand flat on the cool surface of the vitrine, protecting Leonardo's drawing. It was not a gesture of ownership, but of connection, a communion across 500 years. The waitress and the genius, the broken and the healed, two custodians of fragile things standing together in the quiet heart of a storm they had weathered, ready for the work to begin.